Hello everybody. So this week's lecture we're going to talk about fire and plant interactions, and really when we're saying that we're going to focus on the idea of adaptations and the way that plants have learned to live with fire, such as this longleaf pine seedling right here, that as long as this bud right here is unburnt, doesn't matter how much the rest of this thing is burnt, as long as this part isn't burnt, longleaf pine will survive. So longleaf pine, very used to having fire in its life history. Now longleaf pine grows in the southeastern U.S., but it's a perfect example of what we're going to be talking about here today in fire and plant interactions, because it loves fire, it needs fire, and as long as you just don't burn this one part, you can burn all the rest of it, and it's going to be fine. It's going to recover, and it's going to do even better than it did before. So let's get into it. The chapter starts off with this quote: "Pyrodiversity creates biodiversity," from Martin and Sapsis. And what that really is getting into is the idea that that not all fire is the same, and because not all fire is the same, we get the biodiversity that we do see. And it's the idea to just, not only is it not the same fire over and over again, but the timing of the fire is different, and the intensity of the fire is different, and then the amount of fuel that's available at the time is different, and all of that just keeps it changing and keeps this kind of constant flux, and basically creates biodiversity, because we have all these different parts of the ecosystem in all these different stages of flux. Let's slide myself over to the top right here, or maybe the bottom right. I'll hang out in the ash for now. So in terms of fire and plant interactions, many species in California have responses to fire, or really when we're saying have a response to fire, have a response to a fire regime. This enables them to survive and even thrive for a lot of them. And then species persist because they possess traits that permit them to tolerate or depend on a specific fire regime. So it's almost similarly how you would say that something is adapted to the ecosystem. When you say something's adapted to the ecosystem, what you can also say here in California is that it's adapted to the fire regime of that ecosystem, because it's just such a natural part of the ecosystem. The fire effects on plants is a result of the interactions between the chemical and physical properties of fire and the plant characteristics. And then, like I had mentioned earlier, species adapt and evolve. So you will see fire effects at landscape levels. So when you look at, all of ponderosa pine in North America, you can see fire effects at that level. But then you can also see it at the local level when, if you just go to the same area and it got burned once 10 years ago, and then it got burned 20 years before that, you'll be able to see those different effects from the fire just in that one localized spot. But then you'll also be able to see it if you look at it in the big, huge landscape level as well. And so one of the terms that we use is pyrophyte, and so those are plants that have adapted to tolerate fire. So if you hear pyrophytic plant, or something described as a pyrophytic plant, it's a plant that has adapted to tolerate fire. Survival and reproductive strategies have been shaped by the presence of fire and plant morphological and physiological traits. And so when we say morphological traits, we're saying the structure of the plant. When we're saying plant physiological traits, we're talking about the fire changing or altering the chemical makeup in the plants. When we talk about fire-adapted species, we can kind of break it down into fire resistors and fire persisters. So when we say fire resistors, those are ones that are on the site, and they're there to, they've set themselves up or adapted in a way that they are going to be able to resist fire and resist damage from fire. Excuse me. Okay. Try that again. So fire resistors, they resist damage from fire. they've got structures within them that protect them from heat damage. The one that we're going to talk about quite a bit is the idea of having thick bark, because we see it a lot in the conifer species that we have out here in California. Then you also have fire persisters. So these are the ones that are ready to regrow after fire. They have some sort of way of regenerating or sprouting. Usually it's also through the idea of seed, either seed survival, seed release, or seed germination. And so they've got some sort of plan that if fire does come, they're ready to regrow and get started again after fire comes through. So let's talk about resistance and resistance to fire. So we'll start with those fire resistors. So heat kills the cells by causing structural damage and disrupting cellular metabolism. That's what actually happens to the tree. The fire brings the heat. The heat then kills the cells in the tree by causing structural damage and disrupting the cellular metabolism. So plants develop morphological structures that enable them to resist that heat. So what are we talking about? Well, a plant's life form, size, and structure determine how it's affected by fire. So when we're saying their life form, is it a annual or is it a perennial? Is it a tree, shrub, grass, herb? And so, well, how does that differ? Well, there's lots of different examples, but a simple one is that annuals may use seed because they won't have the energy reserves to grow, whereas a perennial will grow new roots or stems or leaves following the fire and just grow from there. So if it's an annual, it's got its one shot to give up all of its energy and get growing for that year, and then it's going to die off and then try again next year. Whereas a perennial knows that it's got to stick around for a few years, and it might not even get going this year. It might be till next year, and so it's got energy reserves and energy stored up to where it can handle that disturbance. Whereas the annual, it's going to have to rely on seeds that are in the ground, or maybe seeds that fall to the ground once the fire has run through it, because it doesn't have anywhere to save up that energy. So it depends on the life form and the size and the structure of the plant in terms of how it's going to figure out how to resist. Plants survive fire by having insulating tissues above or underground. And when we say underground, these tissues help insulate the soil. And so that, and soil, because we discussed that in a previous chapter, is a terrible conductor of heat. That's how the plant is going to help protect its roots and rhizomes and whatever else it's got growing underground to make sure that it can be able to resist fire. So here's some examples of some plant structures. So we've got vegetative structures, we've got sprouting structures, and we got sexual reproduction structures. So in terms of vegetative structures, we're talking about the foliage, the crowns, the bark, the roots. In terms of sprouting structures, you could have epicormic buds, which are buds in the stem, basal burls, buds at the stems, caudexes, corms, and bulbs, stolons, rhizomes, sprouting roots. We'll mention some of these later. Sexual reproduction, you could have fire-stimulated flowering, you could have serotinous cones, and you could have seed banks. And so this table right here gives you a definition of what each of these things are that we're talking about. It gives you the potential factors associated with fire response, and then it also gives you a species that you could find here in California. I don't expect you to know specifically down to the species, but I do expect you to be able to tell me, a vegetative structure, a sprouting structure, a sexual reproduction structure, and how it reacts to fire. So in terms of trying to give you a picture of some of these, like what do they look like, those things we were just talking about in the table. So here's our tree, here's its trunk. So we got our epicormic buds and sprouting. So out of the trunk you just see new branches sprouting out. We also have sprouts around the base, or basal sprouting. So this is out of a lignotuber here, this basal sprout. We've got our structural roots, which are going to be our deeper, larger roots, and we've got our feeder roots, which are going to be kind of our shallow roots, kind of near the surface, that are going to try and help get the water and everything in that wonderful topsoil. Here's some of those other things: the caudex, the bulbs, the rhizome, buried bulbs. So rhizomes are underground stems, so we can kind of see how these stems are connecting together, and those are the rhizomes. We see this corm here, which is like a bulbal tuber. So it's a tube, but it's a bulb, so kind of a fatter tube underground. We got a root crown and buried buds, and then stolons near the surface, and then also some aerial buds here. So all these different ways that that trees and woody plants can reproduce or kind of keep going after fire. Slide myself into the hot stuff. So with buds, the definition of a bud is a mass of plant tissue from which new shoots, leaves, and stems form. So buds will vary in their degree of protection depending on the amount and type of insulating tissues surrounding them. So I discussed this earlier, but this is another picture of longleaf pine. This one's down in Texas. And you can see the fire here, you can see a pine cone here, and you can see how much of this this is a little seedling of longleaf pine has burned up. But in here is a big white bud, sometimes referred to as a candle because it's white and it's long. And as long as that white bud doesn't burn up, doesn't matter how much the rest of this burns up, as long as that white bud is okay, this tree will be fine. Now that is not the case for all trees, and that's kind of one of the big takeaways from this. I mean, we're talking about fire and plant interactions, and we're not going to say, like, this is how they interact, A, B, C, D, and D, and that's it. There's all sorts of variations to it. This is a species that loves fire, is well adapted to fire, and kind of needs fire. It makes itself into this almost bunch grass looking formation when it's on the ground, and that's kind of to hide this bud and also protect it. And then it'll eventually, once fire comes around or whatever and forces it to shoot up and start growing as a tree, it'll still have this bud protected. Because for longleaf pine, kind of the name of the game is, as long as my bud is fine, doesn't matter what's going on. It's spending a lot of time when it's on the ground growing down, getting those structural roots set. And as soon as those structural roots are set and the bud's protected, it's going to shoot up. It's going to be a nice, straight, beautiful looking pine tree, as long as that bud keeps protected from fire. In terms of another part, so we started off talking with the buds. Let's talk about the crown and the foliage. So when we're talking about the foliage, we're talking about the leaves and needles. And when we're talking about the crown, we're talking about, when you go up the trunk, once we start hitting branches and foliage, then we're in the crown of the tree. And a canopy would be a bunch of crowns of trees. And so the foliage fuels plant growth by taking solar energy, turning it into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. So the structure of the crown and the moisture content are the primary determinants of fire effects on foliage. And so a big example of that is conifer trees and the idea of self-pruning, because the amount of crown retained can be important in some conifers in terms of their survival to fire. And so this picture, I think, paints a pretty good idea. And basically, these fires know, or these trees know that fire is going to kind of run on the surface fire, but, and this is the southeastern U.S. again, but it can sometimes get these plants and shrubs where it's a little bit high up. So it knows if it doesn't do something like self-pruning, the fire is going to end up being, a little bit higher, and it could end up hurting the crown. So what these trees do is they self-prune. And so you'll see, like if you look at this tree back here in the back, you see this little stub sticking out. And what they do is as they get older, they're just going to kind of lose those ones to the bottom, and they're just going to keep their crown up high and tight. So that way when the fire rolls through here, there's only the stem, and then they grow their bark thick enough that it can handle the heat and it won't kill the cambium, and then there's no you're not getting that crown scorch or damage, and this tree is going to avoid getting killed. Whereas this guy here, you can see it's a younger one, so it hasn't got to that self-pruning phase yet, but it's got its foliage all the way down here, and it's easily going to get some crown scorch, and this guy might not survive this fire. And so it's just that's one of those adaptations that the foliage in the crown has made, to where it basically has shortened itself up. Now how does it decide how high it's going to get? Well, I think it's just going to be an adaptation to what is kind of the average fire, and then also how much crown does this plant need in order to be able to still provide that photosynthetic energy and the nutrients that it converts from that solar energy into the tree. Stems and trunks. This is, I guess, for me personally, kind of my favorite adaptation to fire. And so in terms of our stems and trunks, they provide structural support for the foliage, and it also provides nutrient and water transportation between the roots and the crown through the xylem and the phloem. Trees in fire-prone areas develop thicker bark because thick bark doesn't burn easily. And so it protects the inside of the trunk from heat damage during high-frequency, low-intensity fires. And what I think is interesting also is that bark thickness will increase as the tree grows, because I think if you kind of think of it as a kind of a person, as you get older, you get tougher, you kind of know what to expect more, and you can kind of start shaping your body in a way that you can kind of deal with whatever things might be coming along. And I think the trees are the same way. They know, because they've been there a while, they see the fires that are coming through and what they have to deal with in terms of disturbance. So they're going to thicken up their bark and keep thickening up their bark as they go, so that they can avoid any major problems that might come about. And this is super important because the process of the xylem and the phloem are really important, because you've got your xylem taking your water up from the soil and from the intake from the roots and taking it up through the tree so that the tree gets water from the soil. And then you got the phloem taking the carbohydrates from the converted energy in the foliage and taking that down through the trunk and getting it all through the tree so that the tree can keep growing. So you got that process, that kind of highway of nutrients and water flowing through this thing. And so the bark, the tree understands this, and the tree then uses the bark as this protector to make sure that process isn't going to be stopped no matter what. You got a fire, you got bugs, you got whatever coming. I know that this part needs to really be protected for sure. And so I'm going to make sure that I'm going to put up my defenses here and not have this be a weak spot at all, because I know this could be a problem, and I really don't want to deal with that. So I'm going to make sure to have thick bark. A great example of this is what I have a picture of here on the left, which is a ponderosa pine. The scientific name being Pinus ponderosa, nice and easy to remember. This is what some people would call a signature tree in the western United States, because just once you see it, you're like, oh, there's a ponderosa pine, and it's just obvious every time you see one. It's got thick, flaky bark. Some people kind of call it like a jigsaw puzzle tree, because it looks like you could just put pieces, different pieces in different places. But it's got really thick bark if you ever can go up to one and touch it. Really thick bark that protects that cambium inside and protects that xylem and phloem process. And then also self-prunes. If you look at these bigger, older ponderosa pines compared to the young trees next to it, you can see all that foliage down low, whereas you can't even see where the crowns start on these ponderosas. And so this, when you see this thick bark, you see the self-pruning, you say to yourself, well, this tree is just made to withstand low-intensity surface fires. This tree wants fire to just come right through here, kind of take out everything down here, and leave all of this alone. And it's designed itself to be that way. And I find that this kind of thing interesting because you really start to kind of see it opens your eyes to kind of the game and the idea of these adaptations aren't on accident. This tree doesn't look like this on accident. This tree has had to live through generation and generation. There were trees that came before it, and it's just an adaptation and an understanding of how this ecosystem works that I'm going to design myself like this to be able to withstand all that's coming so that I'm going to be able to be fine once these, this predictable fire pattern happens. So, just trying to take a look inside of a cross section of a tree. So we got this thick bark on the outside trying to protect everything on the inside, because inside we've got our phloem layer, which is taking our food or our carbohydrates, our converted energy down from the foliage. We got our cork layer, which is our cork and our phloem is part of it's our what would be called the inner bark. This would be the outer bark, this layer here. You've got the cambium layer, which produces the xylem in the phloem and creates it. And then you've got your sapwood layer, which is your xylem layer that's conducting water and minerals up from the soil. And then within there, we've got our heartwood, and that's our dead tissue, which is there for rigidity and structural support for our tree. And that's the inside of a cross section of a tree. And so it's one thing that becomes really important to understand is cambial kill and how to avoid basically the inside of the tree getting heated up. And one of the things that can really cause a problem with cambial kill is the accumulation of woody or down fuels at the base of plants. And so this usually comes in the form of litter and duff just piling up at the bottom of a tree. And it might look nice, and we know based on what we learned in previous chapters that litter and duff, they act as a sponge, so they keep it nice and moist, and they can have minerals and nutrients available, and they're converting soil and organic matter. So they're helpful, except in this one instance that if they catch fire and if it's a big thick layer, it's going to end up holding heat for a long time. So this image here on the right, it shows that long duration heating was most prominent when where accumulated forest floor duff was deepest, particularly at the base of mature pines and unburned sites. Temperatures potentially lethal to plant tissues were sustained for several hours as deep as 4 inches near these pines, and sustained temperatures high enough to impact soil nutrients were observed for up to 35 minutes at the soil surfaces. And this was a buddy of mine from when I was at Humboldt, Jesse Cry, who put this together. But you can see, so 574 degrees or somewhere near there is this orange yellowish color, and you can see how much yellowish color is happening at the base of this pine tree. So this tree is just getting cooked from the inside. And where's all this heat going? All this heat is going right up here, right? This tree over here, he's fine. He's going to be all right. But this tree over here, this is really hot temperatures for a really long time, because also, right, if you have a high intensity rip and fire, that sucks, but it also passes real quick. This is going to end up being a high severity fire, because this fire is just going to sit here for hours and hours and hours and smolder. And so bark insulates the cambium and buds and protects them from heat, but the bark can't really do anything if it basically gets subverted, right? This litter and duff, the fire may have started out here, but it's going to come through that litter and duff and then up into the tree and kind of snake that tree from below. And so the bark doesn't matter if you have this litter and duff accumulation problem, because it's going to just go right underneath the bark, and then your tree is pretty much toasted. All right, so we talked about our buds, we talked about crown and foliage, we talked about stems and trunks, so let's talk about roots and underground structures. And so roots absorb water and nutrients from the soil, and those feeder roots near the surface. So right here it says the surface roots. So right there, those are the ones into the soil. They absorb the water and the nutrients. They get it to the trunk, and then the xylem takes it from there. These roots also give the plant structural stability. So in this instance for this tree, it's got a big taproot, but there's also these kind of larger, deeper structural roots. Those ones are working on stability, whereas these surface roots or feeder roots up here, those are the ones working on absorbing water and nutrients. You'll also, in some plants, get rhizomes, and rhizomes are just underground stems. And what we want to avoid is what we just talked about on the slide before, is that smoldering combustion. That's going to cause the greatest root mortality. It's also going to cause the cambial kill, because if we got a litter and duff layer, a thick one, sitting on these roots, it's going to cook these roots, and then when it cooks those roots, the heat's going to conduct and go right into that trunk and get underneath that bark and cook that tree too. So we want to really avoid that. It's not going to be so much of a problem for these deeper roots because they're deeper and they're protected by the soil, and we know soil's not a great heat conductor, but it's really those other these surface roots, feeder roots that we're worried about. Because even if you don't have a thick litter and duff layer, these ones are near the surface. So if the heat is hot enough near the surface, you're still going to cook some of these surface roots. Another thing to think about is that is when you start thinking about season of burn. So when might fire be worse than some other times? Your roots are going to be most susceptible during active growth season, because these roots are going to be out here and they're going to be working hard, and they're going to be stressed because they're saying this plant needs as much water and as much nutrients as I can transfer up here. And so they're going to be working really hard. So you know yourself, if you're working really hard and then all of a sudden you get stressed out, it's really hard to deal with. And it's going to be the same instance for these feeder roots. They're working really hard, and then all of a sudden you have a big fire blaze through. They're just not going to have the energy to really be able to really react to that fire, and they might end up being lost to the fire because they're working really hard during that time. And then grasses. So what about grasses? So grasses have growing tissues called apical and intercalary meristems. Intercalary just meaning it's at the base of the leaf instead of out towards the tip. Apical means your growing tissues are at the tip. Intercalary means that it's at the base of the leaf. So you either have growing tissues at the tip or the base, or both. And they allow for survival following repeated burns. Intercalary meristems are really important for this because they're at the base. So if you've ever wondered to yourself, why can you mow grass, or why can cows go grazing on grass, or why can a fire come through and then the grass still keeps growing afterwards? It's because the growing part is not just up here. There's some growing tissue down here. So even if you chop up all of this and get rid of all of that, you still got some growing tissues down here that are ready to go once they get more water and nutrients and have the energy to grow. Annual grasses are usually killed by the fire, especially if they're cured, and so they're going to use seed to try and reoccupy a site, because obviously they're not going to really have anything left to actually sit there and try and grow with, for the most part. And that's if they get completely burned off. Perennial grasses depend on how well the meristem, which we were just talking about, or if it's got a bud, is protected, and also the amount of decadent material. And when we say decadent material, we're talking about material that's there due to a lack of a disturbance. So if you say something's decadent, it's that organism or ecosystem or whatever you're talking about is in decline due to a lack of disturbance. So if something has a high amount of decadent material, meaning it's been sitting there and it's got a lot of dead stuff attached to it that's just kind of sitting there, it's going to definitely be more ready for fire. Whereas if it's all fresh, brand new, growing, green stuff, that when the fire comes, it's going to have to dehydrate all this stuff and then burn it off. That's going to be a little more protected. But if you got a bunch of dead material just sitting there right underneath your new material, then all of a sudden you got this perfect little kindling that then brings much more heat to that, and then all of a sudden we can cook off all that water real quick, and then we can burn off the whole grass. So the amount of decadent material really becomes important in terms of grasses. And so this is why having disturbance, especially in areas where disturbance is needed, not in every area, but in a lot of areas, there's a need for some sort of a disturbance. And so that's why it's good to keep up natural disturbance patterns if we can. So how do, I'll slide myself over. I'm hiding right in the key part of it. I'll just go in this corner here. How do we get our trees to survive sometimes? So we talked about resistance before. So let's talk about those fire persisters. And so when we talk about persistence and colonization, the big thing, there's two big things we really kind of focus on. And it's sprouting, and then it's seed, some sort of a seed source. And so with sprouting, when we say sprouting, it's the growth of new tissues. And there's 4 specific ways that we can talk about. There's apical, which is from terminal buds, so usually up top somewhere. Epicormic, which is from the bolls or the branchlets, or just basically sticking out of the trunk. You've got basal from collars or lignotubers, and then you've also got below ground sprouting from rhizomes. And so this redwood tree right here, this is a big old redwood tree right here, and we can see this sprout coming out here. And this is a close-up, but this is the base of the tree. So this would be a basal sprout coming up off this redwood tree right here. The other idea is cedars, plants that have buried or have fire-activated seed stores. And so those ones, it's just relying on either long-lived seed beds, or the idea that the fire itself will do something to the plant that will then make it release seed, or that it has seeds on it that then will be germinated due to the fire, due to the presence of the chemicals in the fire. There's a few different ways that it works with seeding. So let's go into a little more detail about sprouting. So sprouting, our definition of sprouting, a physiological response stimulated by damage. And when we say damage, it can be fire, wind, flooding, or animals. And it's usually that damage is to the top or the crown of the plants. When sprouting, you can regenerate an entire crown from protected epicormic buds and energy reserves. Your sprouting tissue can be killed by short exposure to high-intensity fire or long duration of low-intensity fire. And if you get the long-duration fires, whoa, I didn't hit any buttons. That was magic. There we go. If we get long-duration fires, those have the poorest sprouting response. Our greatest sprouting response comes after a moderate intensity fire, because some of the buds will get killed, but not all of the buds will get killed. So then all the rest of the buds are like, oh, my buddy got killed. I need to go do something right now. So actually with your moderate intensity ones, where some of them are getting killed and some of them aren't, that's when you actually get your greatest sprouting response. Sprouting, we talked about it before, on all the different types of vegetative structures that can sprout, but aerial stems, rhizomes, bulbs, corms, lignotubers, roots, stolons, root crowns. Almost all or most of these structures also store energies, because we said earlier in this slide the idea that you can regenerate the entire crown from some epicormic buds and some energy reserves. So almost all of these have some sort of stored carbohydrates, so that, you know, if it were to happen, they've got the energy to get after it and start regrowing. Older plants can sprout more because they just have more available buds and more stored energy and nutrients, because they're older, they're bigger, they can hold more stuff. And they're able to sprout the least during active growth, which I think it's just kind of, you've started to see the pattern before with the roots, and now you're seeing it the same here with the sprouting, that during active growth, the tree, the woody plant, the grass, whatever it is is going to be at its weakest point because it's spending all of its energy trying to grow, and then it's just not going to have extra energy to be fighting off a disturbance. So with the time we do not want fire is during the active growth season, but that actually usually works out well for us because active growth is kind of happening right now during the months of March, April, and then our fire season's usually starting in May, June, or hopefully later. But fire season keeps creeping and getting a little bit earlier every year, so it's something you got to kind of think about and worry about in the back of your head. Seeds. So in terms of seeds, seeds are going to be important to many plant species for post-fire perpetuation, or just the idea of how do I survive after a fire. The seeds can be stimulated by heat or chemicals in smoke or charred wood. Well, how do I know if it's going to be by heat, or how do I know it's going to be by the smoke and the charred wood? Well, if your seed that you're looking at is large, hard, doesn't let water go through it, more than likely that's going to take heat, because it's going to take something really kind of, it's going to take a more kind of violent act to get it to open up, where small water permeable seeds, something like smoke, something that's not going to be as invasive and really kind of hit it and kind of trying to open it up, it's going to be something that it's going to easily be able to pass into it. So smaller water permeable, probably stimulated by smoke. Larger, harder, water impermeable seeds, probably stimulated by heat. Post-fire germination, there's 4 types. So you can have seeds that survive in soil or up in the canopy or in seed banks. They're there, and they're waiting, and then fire comes and it's like, all right, it's our time to shine. You can have some seeds that through fire they germinate. So the fire will rupture the seed coat. So this is the example for Serotoninous cones, which we're going to talk about in detail. Fire enhanced seedling establishment and survival. So the idea that because fire has cleared everything else out, it's created this great area that now the seeds get dropped into that, and there's nobody there to compete with it. So the seedlings are able to come up super easy. And then the 4th type of post-fire germination is the idea that it's dispersal from outside the burned area. So the idea that the fire comes through, burns it off, and now there's this big open area, and now the wind blows in some seed, or some water comes in and drops some seed, or some animal comes in to see what's happening in the burned area, and it's got seeds stuck to it, or it comes in and poops, and in the poop there's some seeds. And so there's all sorts of different ways that you can actually get seeds from outside of the burned area that end up growing in that area later. In terms of our species, species that quickly exploit recently burned sites usually have large quantities of long-lived soil stored seeds. So that's our first one there, the survival in soil, canopy, or seed bank. So basically there's a lot of seed just sitting in the ground in a lot of these places, because you've had trees living here and plants living here for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so there's just some seeds sitting in the ground. So if you've got a fire come through, whatever comes up quickly, more than likely there's a lot of that seed there, and it's been there for a while. So it just it's gonna dominate, because there's just more likely the chance that seed is the one that dominates. Seeds on or near the surface are exposed to heat more, so they're either going to be more easily killed, or they're going to be more easily germinated. One or the other is going to happen, but those are the ones that are going to take the heat the most. So they're going to have to either they're going to be loving it because they want that, or they're going to die. So Serotoninous cones, another thing. For me, it's the thick bark and it's the Serotoninous cones. I find them interesting. I think they're fascinating. So in environments where high intensity fires are frequent, so before with ponderosa pine and the thick bark, we're talking about the idea of low intensity surface fires. In environments where the idea is a big crown fire comes through like every 100 years or so, that sort of thing. There's some pine species that have developed very thick, hard cones that are literally glued shut with a strong resin and remain sealed during normal weather conditions. Now, if you read this again and you say, wait a minute, high-intensity fires are frequent. I thought you just said 100 years. Yeah, think about the idea of how long the Earth has existed for. If you think about it that way, 100 years is not very, that can be frequent. That can come up again and again and again and again. In our lifetimes, to think about 100 years, it's like, well, you know, we would be lucky if we got to 100 years. It's just a different way to look at time, right? So these species, they develop these very thick, hard cones. They're literally glued shut with a strong resin, and they remain sealed during normal weather conditions. The closed cones can hang on a pine tree for up to 10 years, allowing the seed inside to mature. Then when a fire sweeps through, the fire, because it's a high-intensity fire, the fire is going to come in, it's going to come raging, it's going to be hot, and it's going to come in, melt that resin. All of a sudden, the cones open up, and all this mature seed comes flying out, and then is dispersed by wind all over the place, or just the idea of gravity dropping it down. Lodgepole pine, which is seen also across the West in almost all the states across the West. It's a species that it has serotinous cones. There's other ones like Monterey pine and Bishop pine and Coulter pine in California. But actually, lodgepole pine, if you find lodgepole pine in the Sierra Nevadas, more than likely it's actually going to be non-serotinous because you don't get this same high-intensity fire regime. You'll get that in Colorado. You'll get that in Wyoming. Places in the Intermountain West, but out here it doesn't. In Sierra Nevada mixed conifer, you get more of the low intensity surface fire regime because you got ponderosa pines also growing up there. So it's actually a non-serotinous variety of lodgepole pine in California. So let's take a look at that. Move myself down here. So this is the idea. So the cone is closed up, and these bracts and the pine cone here, they're all kind of glued together, and they're not going to open up until there's some sort of stimulation by fire where it actually melts that glue. And then when it does, the pine cone opens up like this, and the seeds, which were hidden underneath each of these scales, just drops on out, and it either gets dispersed in the wind or just dispersed down through gravity. Now is a good time to pause the video. Go to the lecture notes, click on this link, and the University of Wyoming extension will teach you a little bit more about serotinous cones. All right, move myself up here next to Mr. Blackbird here. So another way that that seed gets dispersed is through dispersal, colonization, and establishment. And so let's talk about the idea of residual versus colonizer. When we talk about a residual, we're talking about a species that survives through seed banks or by sprouting in that specific area. So if a fire burns through, this species either had some seed stored in that area where it's going to pop back up, or it has that energy reserve and that some sort of a vegetation structure that's going to allow it to sprout back up after the fire. Whereas a colonizer is not one that survived the fire. It's not from that area. It traveled to the burned area and established post-fire. And so the seeds can travel via wind, water, or animals. And in terms of animals, it's either traveling on their fur, like it got stuck using hooks or burrs or whatever. I'm sure if you played around as a kid or whatever, you got in a burr stuck in you at some point in another, or in the idea of scat. So the idea of something like this blackbird here eating these berries, and then this blackbird flying off, miles and miles away, and then deciding to poop somewhere, and then in that poop comes out some of those seeds. And so you can pause the video right now and click on this link right here, and it'll take you to an article that tells you all about different animals' poop and how it travels to different places, including how important elephants are in Africa to being able to move some plants around and create some biodiversity. So another part of this idea, so this dispersal, colonization, and then the other part of it's the establishment. And so the idea that fire can moonscape or create or knock everything down to bare mineral soil is really helpful in terms of creating favorable conditions for some species. So especially conifer species, sorry about that, especially conifer species are really aided by this because they need a little bit of help to be able to get their roots rapidly into the soil. And if there's competition, they're not going to be successful getting their roots into the soil. But because fire can come through and take it down to mineral soil and really eliminate all that competition, they can readily get their roots into the soil, start getting nutrients and water, and then they can get established much easier, and they would have had a lot harder time if there was competition. So, variation in fire response traits. It's nice to mention all these different things, but can we really, is there one way to do it? Is there one kind of fix-all strategy or one way to talk about it? And the idea is there isn't. There's just a lot of variation in the way that plants respond to fire. The big ones we talked about, sprouting, Serotoninous, seed germination, they can vary not only among species, but among closely related species and even within species or within a population. It might just depend on a few different traits here or there. One thing we do want to talk about is the difference between obligate and facultative. So if something is obligate, it depends on one strategy, whereas if it's facultative, it depends on multiple strategies. So if you have an obligate sprouter, it's a organism that sprouts but then doesn't have any seed, and it's not going to rely on any seed. If you have an obligate reseeder, it doesn't sprout, and it depends only on the idea that there's seeds in the ground, and that's how it's going to come back after fire. This is common in chaparral in California. If it's facultative, like we said, it has multiple strategies. So you'll hear the term facultative seeder, which means it resprouts and it also does post-fire seedling recruitment, because it basically it wants to make sure it survives, so it's got multiple ways to do it. Areas where you get a surface-dominated fire regime, where sometimes it might be low intensity, sometimes it might be moderate intensity, sometimes it might be high intensity, but usually it's a surface fire, not a crown fire. That sort of thing is common in mixed conifer and Sierra Nevadas, and because of the mix of fires and the mix of species in the area, you get a mix of responses. You'll get some of these things happening, you'll get some things happening sometimes, but then not the next time. You get this mix of responses because you get the mix of the different types of fires and the different species and the different situations going on in terms of seasonality, intensity, and all those things, and fire return interval, and so it just kind of depends for something like that, and that's what we're talking about with this variation. One thing that I do find interesting is that people often think that riparian plants and wetlands are very weak when it comes to fire, and actually riparian plants are vigorous sprouters, and because of the available moisture in riparian areas, you can actually get riparian plants that get burned off in a fire, and then often in the same week they are already back to growing because they just have that available moisture, those available nutrients, because of all that biodiversity and water hanging out there in the riparian area. And so you can actually get those plants coming right back up within the same week after a fire. And so to give you kind of an idea of that look, this idea of facultative versus obligate. So we've got a non-sprouter here, just a regular old tree growing, right? And so then post-fire with our non-sprouter, we got some seedlings growing. Our facultative sprouter, we've got it here before the fire, and then after the fire, we're gonna sprout up, and we're going to have our little seedlings here. If we got our obligate sprouter here, it only is going to sprout, right? So after the fire, it's only going to sprout up. It's not going to have any seed bank or anything else that it worries about, right? Our non-sprouter, it's all about the seed bank. Our facultative sprouter, we're going to use some of the seed bank, and we're going to sprout. And then our obligate sprouter, where we only sprout, all we're going to rely on is our sprouting. There's also this table in your book, 8.2, where it's modified Bond and Van Wilgen and Passos and Keeley classifications of plant reproductive responses to fire for California flora. And so they came up with this idea of fire dependent, fire enhanced, fire neutral, or fire inhibited. And so the idea that fire would inhibit the species, it doesn't really show any reaction to fire. Fire enhances what that species does, and then fire dependent, where this species would not be here unless fire was there to help it out. And so it gives you it tells you what it does in terms of sprouting or non-sprouting, and then it kind of gives you some examples of the different species like black oak and ponderosa pine, and kind of just takes you through this idea of, okay, if it's a non-sprouter, it's an obligate cedar. Is it not killed by fire? Is it killed by fire? And then how does it respond? And so it's just another way to look at it. But this idea that there are species that are fire dependent, they will not be there without fire. Species that can be enhanced by fire and can their recruitment of others species can be enhanced by fire, or stuff doesn't really react to fire, or fire actually makes it harder for this species to live on. And so I found these a couple of years ago, and I just think that they are fun and amazing to look at. And it just kind of gives you some of these ideas. So giant sequoia, which is one of those species down here that's near and dear to your heart. They've got fire-resistant bark, up to 2 feet thick, but 6 to 8 inches is more common. And then they also do seed germination. So giant sequoia seeds germinate well in mineral soil. So this is one of those ones where we talked about the idea of fire coming through, moonscaping everything, creating that mineral soil, so that when giant sequoia wants to drop its seeds in the ground, and giant sequoia sometimes can have serotinous seeds as well. So the fire comes, opens up those seed cones. We want that bare soil so that when it drops in there, there's no competition and they can easily come back up again. There's also fireweed, but California black oak is another species that we'll see often, and that's the oak tree you see growing in the woodlands as we go up into the Sierras. So their historical fire pattern, so before modern fire suppression practices, California black oak forests experienced low severity fires once every 10 years, so they got used to that pattern. And then after fire, the fire can thin the canopy, so it opens up some light, and then that actually they are facultative, so they got both sprouts and seedlings coming up. You got ponderosa pine. So ponderosa pine's got that fire-resistant bark, and also self-prunes. We talked about both of those ideas. California lilac, which you'll hear a lot of people just refer to it by its genus, which is Ceanothus. That's a common chaparral species. And so we said in chaparral, it's really, they're more about the seeds and being obligate seeders. So it talks about the idea of the buried seeds that it has and puts them into the soil so that when a fire does come through, they're still protected by the soil, but then also the soil seed bank, because seeds require fire to germinate. You also are dropping some seeds to accumulate a soil seed bank every year. So you got some seeds sitting at the top, but you also got some buried down deep just in case it's a really big fire. And then knobcone pine, you can see right here as well. But those are some of my favorite species, and I don't know who, well, I guess I do know it. It's the USDA fire effects people, but I love these graphics. I think they're great, and then it still tells you about these plant adaptations. And then this is what I'll leave you with for today in terms of our lecture on fire and plant interactions. So this is spring in San Diego in 2008. Hillside of California poppies above Lake Hodges following the 200,000 acre Witch Creek fire of the previous October. So I know when people hear like 200,000 acre fire in California, they're like, oh my God, that's awful. All that land burned up. But look, whoops, my bad. Look at how beautiful this is, right? Our state flower, the California poppy, and just hillsides covered in these annual grasses and perennial grasses starting to come up. Well, really just annual since it was burned the previous October. And all these poppies and wildflowers coming up, and just, you know, the process starts again. Fire can be bad sometimes, but fire also can open up the area for some real beauty, and it's amazing to see that interaction between fire and the vegetation in the ecosystem, and really see how the ecosystem kind of works all as one.